new people on stage are Karen Thomas, next to Peter there, who's a partner at Fisher Jeffries Lawyers in Adelaide. Phil Honeywood, CEO of the International Education Association and someone with a very long history in higher education. And Krystal Evans, who's CEO of the BioMelbourne network, which is an industry association. I think we should start with this completions and attrition issue. Grattan's been doing some work on this as well. I think we've got a slightly different take on it. We agree that the trend is not getting dramatically worse. I think that's definitely true based on the numbers that have come out. But we do think there's probably a group of people who are taking high personal risks in going on to higher education. And often this is from an accumulation of risk factors. So studying part-time, we believe, is an extremely high risk factor, very low completions among part-time. Studying externally, a small addition. Men are at higher risk. Once you just start adding risk factor on risk factor on risk factor, you probably get to a point where this is a complicated issue for the students, but they don't actually know about it. And so I guess this is the question I would have to the panel is, to what extent do we need to assess at an individual level what kinds of risks they're taking on? Not to say that they should do higher education, but to make it clear what kind of choice they're making. Phil?
I guess one of the findings that our investigations brought forward was the sheer lack of resourcing and, in many cases, probably inappropriateness of some of the careers advice that is going on, and that unfortunately post-secondary institutions seem to have handballed career advice to the high schools, and then the careers advisors are often, shall we say, not professionally trained to give the appropriate advice, and invariably students are turning to friends or to parents for advice as to which direction they're going to take, and often that leads to inappropriate course enrolment for many of them. So I think that whole career advisor space is one in which a great deal more work could be done, and I think the post-secondary education institutions have a responsibility to provide at least initial and hopefully some ongoing advice as to whether a course is actually suited to that individual student's needs and aspirations and personality, etc. That's a whole separate investigation that we would love to do amongst the many others that we've been doing.
Karen, do you think the universities have a stronger role to play in possibly in selection or possibly also in advising the student?
Probably more in terms of transparency of information available about where courses and careers marry up. I think we've moved a long time from education for education's sake, and there is a huge, if you like, focus in the industry on careers outcome. So I think that that's one thing we've been concerned about is there's a lot of data, but for students, particularly in year 11 and 12, under a lot of pressure, they don't have a lot of time, energy or inclination to actually get to the right information. So I think that's what we've seen.
And we have seen some good examples of best practice, particularly in some regional universities or universities who are serving communities that have a high number of students who are first in family or from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who have got great programs for career advice and course selection, and even just raising aspiration around higher education. And so I think, again, it comes back to Peter's point around having a strong evidence base for the impact of some of those programs and having a coordinated way of sharing best practice.
One thing I think we didn't mention, which would also come out in our report on completions, we think there is significant value in having more opportunity for nested qualifications within a degree. So that a student who may want to leave after a year or two with a diploma rather than a degree is able to do so, and then perhaps in a few years' time to return. I think what we've got to do is to get our institutions much more flexible in terms of meeting student demands now. And, you know, many people do want to be able to drop out after a few years. You know, even when we look at student completion rates after 9 years, there's another report that's come out which shows that even after that time, a significant number of the 25% who haven't completed actually do return to university education in the future.
And this is where I think, to Peter's point, a lot of the new HEPs and private providers are more nimble in this space, and we discovered that a number of private providers are ensuring that there are these exit points. You know, after year one you get a diploma, after year two an associate degree or advanced diploma, year three a degree, and the exit point comes down to often having a unit of study that is related to job skills or, for example, you might start out doing an accounting degree, but at the end of year one, you've got enough qualification to be a bookkeeper and to exit into a bookkeeping position. I've discovered, or we've discovered rather, as a panel, that some of the new HEPs are actually doing a lot in this space, which the universities are a bit slower to catch up on.
Does this reflect funding differences that in the new HEP space, who are almost all full fee, that you can offer a diploma, whereas in the bachelor degree in the public university, that's the only uncapped category, and therefore there are caps on the diploma. So is that do you think that's an issue with the public universities?
Well, yes, I do. The answer is yes, I do think it's one of the issues. And you could imagine looking forward, the difficulty is, I think, that we still tend to think within our own institutional structures of the universities, the non-universities, the dual sector institutions, the vocational sector institutions. And I think that used to work, but I think students are increasingly not thinking along those institutional lines, which helps to explain actually why far more students who've completed university then go on to vocational education than in fact all those who are coming from vocational education pathways into university. That, I think, has got to be telling us a story.
Yeah, there's definitely going both ways. A lot of them are doing extra qualifications related to their original field,
Correct.
so it's quite interesting that they're using both systems in order to get their career outcome. What are your views on performance funding, sort of as a complement or a substitute to the kinds of things we're talking about here in dealing with completion?
I think in principle, the idea of performance funding is correct. The difficulty is, well, what do you use in that performance funding? And it seems to me the area of university completions is one of the more controversial things you would use. Because if our evidence is right, and you look at all those characteristics that you have talked about, but it is actually still a pretty small part of what explained, the issue is, well, to what extent can you put university completions as one of the measures you would use for performance? Because we've talked about, having unexpected outcomes from government policy. You imagine that you are at a university and you have been told, for example, that your access to a performance fund will be lost if your student non-completion rate is more than 20%. What do you think one of the outcomes of that might be? I would have thought there'll be pressure on the institutions modifying what they do in order to meet those completion targets. So I think the idea of performance assessment is really good. We've got to actually make sure we choose the performance characteristics that, again, not only can't be gained, but don't have the consequences that we would not want for good public policy.
We haven't mentioned in this conversation QUILT and the quality indicators of learning and teaching, which we have a role with the QUILT data group and working group who report to the panel. What we've discovered there is it started out as a bit of a clunker, but now it's become quite a useful resource, and both new HEPs and public universities are finding that the information that's been put on that website is being accessed by both domestic and international students increasingly. It's based on, obviously, graduate career outcomes, which is in itself a performance measure. I guess my only sad reflection is that in my generation, you went to university not to get a career, you went to university to get a great education. Nowadays, the whole focus seems to be on career, and that in itself raises a whole issue around performance funding, because if it's all about job outcomes, then, of course, that's not necessarily a community good 100% of the time.
Maybe that reflected the luxury of guaranteed employment at the end.
Well, I think also one of the great metrics on the Quilt website is around student satisfaction, and I still think that does play a very strong role in choice, and I think the more information that students can be given about the experience of higher education and the more transparent it is, I think the more informed they're going to be about choosing somewhere where an environment in which they know they are best placed to succeed.
What I like about Quilt too, Andrew, is that it really does dilute the traditional rankings of research output and so on. It really starts to, we've discovered, particularly for international fee-paying students, it starts to allow them to drill down and say, well, that institution may not have the highest ranking as a group of 8 or whatever, but this institution over here has got the best student satisfaction, graduate career outcome, etc., based on Quilt for a niche course. So it really allows students to drill down into providers they may not normally have enrolled with for the right reasons.
So what's missing from Quilt? What doesn't it have in detail that it should have? The attrition data, for example?
What it's beginning to have, which, and I know it's early stage, is around the great data on actually what employers think. I mean, that's one of the metrics that is on there, but I think that one will only continue to become more important. And I think it's actually quite significant because employers employ people, not CVs. And I think that the more student experience information that students take into account as part of their career planning, actually it kind of almost comes full circle back to the fact that you are more than your qualifications, and that some of the experiences that you have at university around those soft skills are actually what makes you most employable. So I think Quilt will only continue to become more important when looking at those employer graduate surveys, when they look at things like, well, what kind of employability skills, foundation skills, how employable are they? So I think that some of that softer metrics are actually going to start to play a more increasingly
I think some of it is also improving the criteria that are there. I think Australia has been very innovative in looking, for example, at employer satisfaction and starting to focus on connecting with the supervisor rather than the employer at the top or the HR manager. I think that's much better. I think the more we have information, for example, on student outcomes after 4 years and not after 6 months is also, I think, much more valuable information.
Have we found the way to get a good sample of supervisors though? Because I realise this was done on a recommendation basis, and if your supervisor hated you, you're probably not going to recommend that they respond to a survey. Is there a way of getting around this?
This is a vexed issue. I know when I was Minister in Victoria for Tertiary Education and Training, I'd occasionally get that dreaded call from the Premier of the day. If anybody knows Jeff Kennett, you can imagine what it was like being a minister. And the call would come, I've been speaking, Honeywood, to the CEO of BHP in the Chairman's Lounge today, and he's told me that your department are not providing the appropriate skills that BHP need for their workforce. And of course, invariably what I have to say to Jeff was, Premier, you're talking to the CEO of BHP, but the CEO of BHP is sending to the skills or the industry skill advisory boards that state governments and federal governments rely upon, the junior HR manager, because nobody else, they're not sending the factory manager or the mine manager, they're sending a HR manager to talk about the skill requirements of BHP. And there's a disconnect often between the rhetoric that comes out of industry in terms of different levels of their expectation from government and from education providers, because the advice stream is often not the appropriate level.
There is, I think, another problem which the panel has been looking at in terms of employer satisfaction, but it's a different indicator, which is the extent to which professional associations are in effect having a significant influence on what is taught at the institution, the university, in order to get professional accreditation. Now, in many instances, not all, but many instances, what tends to happen is that professional associations are trying to produce students who meet the qualifications for a profession in 2017. And we all know that I can't think of any profession right now which is not going to have changed fundamentally in this next 10 years. So in fact, I think we've got to step back and say, well, let's go back to the basics of what university used to teach, which isn't just that professional accreditation training type of course, but that ability to learn over time, that ability to conceptualise and analyse, which you can then take forward in your career, where we know our students that are graduating now, their lives are going to be transformed over 30 years by the changing workforce that they're going to be in.
Yes, I want to get this topic. Phillips KPA has done a very interesting survey, which is on the HESP website, of the practices around this. So effectively, this is kind of a very large additional form of, semi-quality assurance on top of what TEXA does, and probably a much more onerous one on the particular faculties concerned. Is this a bigger issue, just going beyond this academic issue of are they prepared for the future? Is this a bigger issue for costs and inconsistency with what TEXA is doing?
There is, I think, if there's duplication. What the panel is absolutely clear about is that in terms of the educational standards, professional associations really should leave that part of it to TEXA to do. And what they should be focusing on are their own professional accreditation requirements. At the moment, there is a grey area between those two, and you would often, therefore, get professional associations asking things, making requirements, even when those courses have been gone through a TEXA accreditation process.
We now have over 100 professional accreditation bodies in Australia that, in one way or another, are influencing / interfering with education providers' ability to provide world-class education outcomes. The classic example I'll give you is ANMAC, the Nursing Midwifery Association, where I met with the CEO of ANMAC earlier this year. She informed me, Phil, we're faced with a shortage of nurses in Australia of around 40,000 by 2025. And yet, on the other hand, ANMAC have just decided to increase the entry level for English language to IELTS 7 for an enrolled nurse, so for the junior nurse category. Now, what that immediately means is that all the international students that Australia is relying on, particularly in regional Australia, to be the nurse carers for our aged care and for many other hospital patients, etc. I defy a lot of Australian-born to have IELTS 7 across the 4 different categories. And to be an engineer in Australia, you only have to have IELTS 6.5 when you graduate. But to enter a junior nurse level course now in Australia, you're going to have IELTS 7 English language level. So these barriers to entry are being dictated by professional associations that often are not in touch. I'm sure ANMAC, without casting aspersions on them, do a fantastic job, but often they're not actually drilling down into perhaps the exit rather than the entry level requirements.
I think you have cast aspersions for it. So do we need to sort of, accredit the accreditors? Is there some role for a TEXA or a TEXA-like body in deciding who is going to be accredited, which we have in the United States, for example, that the accreditation bodies are accredited themselves? Is there a role for that?
So Universities of Australia have just done an agreement with Professions Australia, I think it's called, Peter. Yeah. And our analysis was that there is some really good synergy potential there if more of these professional accreditation bodies were to team up under Professions Association. Also, we discovered that there's a need for professional development of these accreditation organisations, because many of them have been run by people that perhaps might have more of a marketing background or whatever. So we see a role for TESCA to play in auspicing and hosting professional development for some of these 100 plus accrediting bodies.
I agree. I think that there's a great role there again for creating shared communities of practice, particularly because some of these organisations, as you say, are small bodies, in being able to upskill them. But I also think that that it will then hopefully result in some more certainty for higher education providers around expectations.
So this is kind of a very voluntary approach to it first. Would there be any constitutional issues in trying to deal with this? Particularly some of these are actually international bodies as well. So,
the complexity of trying to deal with organisations, some of them are not-for-profit, some of them are volunteers, unfunded, and because we have the federal system, we always have a problem about the constitutional power to regulate. So it's going to be challenging on all levels, I think, legally and practically.
To do it. So one of the other issues you've been working on is looking at this issue of cheating and plagiarism in universities. Tracy Brett has been doing some really interesting work in this area. I think one of her surveys found that 6% of students owned up to cheating, and so presumably the true number is north of 6%. What can we do about this? You know, is it university level? Can government do something about these commercial essay writing organisations?
Well, this is a really interesting and, like everything in the sector, very complex on many levels. I think the first problem will be detection, which is the practical problem. If we skip over detection and then consider there are probably two aspects to it, I think we've got to look at the student, what I would call student teaching, which is the individual, how we manage cheating at the individual level. But then probably the more serious problem for the system is contract or commercial cheating, whereby you have systemised cheating where people are setting up actually businesses to sell or provide or advertise cheating services. What is really difficult from a legal aspect is that in a federal system where we have different states, we have civil and criminal law, the complexity of the existing law is such that anyone who cheats will be creating an offence of either a civil or criminal at either level. But the enforcement of that conduct is just disproportionate in terms of the resources and the cost to do it. So contract cheating is on a different level, and I think that any higher education provider that finds itself challenged by a commercial contract cheating would, as a matter of precedent, want to take it on and spend the resources. Now, New Zealand has quite an interesting example where they don't have a different legal system, so their federal system can just and has legislated to create just a straightforward, it is an offence to provide or advertise cheating services, and they define what cheating is, what service is, and the person can be an individual or a corporation. In Australia, at the federal level or the Commonwealth level, it's very difficult because we've got holes, constitutional power has holes, so while we could perhaps regulate individuals with more difficulty, I think we've got an opportunity to regulate at a, say, business level. A simple fix would be to extend the Australian consumer law, but anything else will require the cooperation of all of the states and the Commonwealth. So my personal view would be that while it would be nice to have a simple legislative solution, the practicality of actually enacting it is not worth the effort, and that really it's for the university sector, who are very sophisticated in terms of the detection, to decide when they're going to make an example of it.
You can see why we have a lawyer on the panel.
Yes. So some of the things the university is doing a bit too big brotherish. One student complained to me that his university was going to force them to write essays in this university environment where it would tell from your keystrokes whether it was you or not. And is that going too far and creating an atmosphere of mistrust between students and their institution?
Well, we heard, I think, this morning from ANU about history students who, in their first week, all they have heard about was footnotes. I actually think that's not bad, because when I look at my university and other universities, I worry about all students hear about, actually, in their first week is plagiarism. I mean, the extent to which now students are told and warned about plagiarism is quite extraordinary, far, far more rigorous than when I was a real academic. And the fact is that with data analytics, it is actually becoming significantly easier now to identify when people are taking other sources from the web. So, in fact, you're not only warned about it, you're also told very clearly that most universities have the capacity now to be able to identify in many instances where people are using sources that have come from elsewhere, or, you know, one of these essay manufacturing schemes.
I think there's a role to play as well in terms of, I guess, pedagogical support, because we hear time and time again that, again, to come back to international fee-paying students, that they come to Australia, they've come from a rote learning school situation, and they're put into project teams in terms of the Australian pedagogical way of life, and often the feedback we get is, well, the domestic students argue that the international students didn't do enough in the project team in terms of to get a combined assessment awarded to them. And this is common feedback, and I'm just concerned that we don't perhaps prepare international students well enough to understand the difference in pedagogy from where they've come from and where they're coming to, and there's a role to play there.
How would we deal with that?
Well, I guess my point is that, you know, we have to respect that universities are autonomous in terms of setting their, you know, plagiarism and cheating kind of policies. But again, I think a lot of that will start to become reflected in student experience, and as that becomes more important and more significant, I think that's where you'll start to see some changes happening in response to that Big Brother situation you described.
Yes. Now, one of the things the Minister announced in the budget was a review of the provider category standards. Fortunately for the Minister, this is one of the few things that does not require Senate approval. Is this likely to be going ahead? And given what you've said, Peter, about, you know, more diversity in the system, would that be an influencing consideration in the standards?
Look, I can't talk for the Minister, but I would have thought on the discussions we've had in HESP so far that there are two things that I'd likely to go ahead in the year ahead. One is looking at the AQF, the Australian Qualifications Framework, and the other is the provider categories. I think the challenge is, well, what is the context within which we do that? Do you just look at AQF? Do you look at provider categories? My own view that there is an opportunity here to do something broader and to put that within the category of, well, let's look at perhaps not even the whole higher education framework, but the whole tertiary education framework, and start to think about, well, where do our old notions of provider categories and qualifications framework sit in? Now that's, I think, so my answer is, I think it is likely that the government will focus on those two issues. I'm not sure how it will do so, but I think the panel, if it was giving advice, was to say, well, let's do it in a wider context, which will give actually meaning to that inquiry.
So what do you think are the main problems with the AQF? Is it creating an artificial divide between the sectors or between occupations? Certainly when the last sort of revision was done in 2013, I sort of spoke to a group of IT deans who complained that it was pushing them away from what the employers actually wanted, which was actually a mix of skills. Some which should be regarded as vocational education, some which should be regarded as higher education. So is it actually pushing us away from the world of work?
Well, I think, because I also chair the National Centre for Vocational Education Research, so I see some of this taking place. Now, what happens there is that if you look at people who are doing Cert 3 or Cert 4, for example, and you look at those who complete their certificates and those who drop out before completing the certificates, the standard of satisfaction of the students, when you ask them, is no different. Students who have only done a few units are just as happy with what they've got from it. So it is clear to me that at least vocational education, we've designed these certificate levels where many of the students who do it actually don't care. In other words, the vocational provider thinks they're coming there to study Cert 4. They're not coming there to study Cert 4. They're coming to study a few units which they think their employer will find useful. Now, what I was suggesting in my address is that I think that is going to spread out of vocational education increasingly into higher education. And people are going to mix and match. We can see it already. When universities talk about competition, yes, then occasionally they'll extend it to the non-university higher education providers. But there is another world that's growing as well, as you know, which is industries providing their own training. So, for example, if you look at AMP, AMP has its own course, not certificated, not under the AQF scheme, for financial planners. It's probably harder to get into the AMP financial planners course over a year than any Masters of Financial Planning. because the students who are going there know that they're going to get a book of business at the end and they're going to get employment through AMP. So increasingly, there's going to be this array of competition. And if we just allow students, they will drive these changes.
And again, I was talking to the CEO of Kaplan last week in Sydney, and Rob Regan, and he was telling me that Kaplan have invested heavily in artificial intelligence in the financial services certification, so that now across a number of, I think Westpac's one of their clients, any employee of Westpac will be going onto a Kaplan auspice system that will identify for them where their knowledge base on the latest certification requirements in their industry is not up to speed, and automatically download for them a top-up certificate course that they have to do in order to be able to proceed in the next step of their career. So it's quite interesting that, again, back to my original point about some of the new HEPs and private providers are more nimble in this space. Artificial intelligence is beginning to definitely be a factor in all of this as well. And then how do you put that into the AQF when you've got an advanced diploma in cyber security? I mean, a motor mechanic nowadays, which used to be a traditional apprenticeship trade, a motor mechanic has to increasingly be an IT expert. Now, is that at vocational level, or is that almost verging on some level between higher education and vocational?
I'll ask one more question before we go to the questions from the floor, so send more through. This is this issue of teaching-only universities, which the Minister mentioned in May. Does this idea have potential, or is the moment for that long gone?
I think the label of teaching-only university now carries such baggage with it. It's very hard to have that discussion. And you may remember when I was Secretary of Employment all those years ago with Brendan Nelson. You know, it's just one of these, because it carries so much emotional emotional content with it. My view is that is probably not the right approach, but I do think, this is personal, not the panel, I do think there really needs to be a fundamental inquiry again by what Australia wants in terms of a tertiary education system.
I would lean on the side of being pro-teaching only universities, because I have a strong view that many universities feel that they have to do research for the sake of research. I have a strong view that the Americans have done some good work in the community college space with teaching only universities. And I think also it comes down again to pedagogy, because I find that with the casualisation of the teaching workforce, both in public universities and in private providers, that are students necessarily getting the best value for money out of a casualised workforce? That's not to say that casual teachers can't be fantastic, but with teaching only universities, who knows, you might actually get more of an emphasis on the quality of the teaching as opposed to the quality of the research output.
Any other points? I've got a range of questions. There's one particularly explosive one there, which is Higher Education Standards Panel considers reports on TEXA's performance. How is TEXA doing?
Well, I hope I'm still invited to dinner tonight. So let me start, because of course HESP bureaucratically came out of two previous organisations, one of which was the TEXA Advisory Council, and I was on that before it then became HESP. Now, when that council was set up, it's fair to say, and in fact the Minister made it very clear, that there was a lot of angst within the higher education sector about the role of TEXA, that it being too heavy-handed with its regulation and so on. I would have to say that TEXA to me is an absolute part of the solution here. It's not part of the problem. I think what it's doing in terms of setting and maintaining standards is vital to students and our international reputation. I think its basis on doing it on the basis of risk and proportionality and necessity is right. And I don't just have to think of the panel. I look at the survey that TEXA itself did in the sector, and you can see that there is a much greater support for TEXA now in the sector, and a view that, in general, it is undertaking the regulation that is necessary in the way that is appropriate.
But with the caveat that TESCA is incredibly under-resourced, and we really do feel for the commissioners and the hard-working staff, particularly given that the churn rate of staff clearly is something that needs to be addressed, because just as I've been despondent about the casualisation of teaching, equally the casualisation or contracting of TESCA staff means that what continuity of, what's the word I'm looking for, of the culture of TESCA, or whatever, the intellectual property, if you like, is being lost. So there's definitely a need to look, I think, at the fees and charges. Unfortunately, in an environment of constant budget savings, the ability for TESCA to get any more money out of government is constrained, but fees and charges, we discovered, were a bit skewed and could be, shall we say, more rationalised and appropriate for the different accreditation requirements that the regulatory authority undertakes.
I really think this conference and the success and interest in this conference really speaks to the way in which TEXA is valued, and I think that TEXA provides value for every player and every stakeholder in the higher education sector. I think everyone benefits from a very strong, respected and efficient regulator, and I think that, yeah, if anything, that if they were to be better resourced, it would actually be incredibly beneficial for all players in the sector. They do a good job with what they've got.
We've got a question about whether there are examples of performance indicators that cannot be gamed. That is, they're unambiguously good and they can't be fudged. Does such an indicator exist?
Well, of course, we go through this with endless university ranking systems, and we have that variety, and they measure different things in different ways. Some are on objective factors like publications, some are highly subjective factors with how academics rate academics from other institutions. You could imagine that there are some of the indicators that you get from the Quilt indicators that you could use in some variety for performance. I think the question is this the best way to drive enhanced performance? By setting aside government funding to do this. The alternative, of course, and governments do this and have done this quite successfully, is to provide funding to push universities to do things that they want. And I think, for example, setting money aside for equity funding has actually helped to drive some very significant changes within university. So that's an alternative approach to doing it. Setting aside money for a performance fund is a bit like paying people performance pay, isn't it? You want to drive performance, but you wonder if fund or pay is the best way to actually do that.
So I've got a question. I think this is probably applying to the non-uni sector, whose courses are accredited as well. Would HES be comfortable for TEXA to accept a professional accreditation in lieu of TEXA's course accreditation? So if you've already gone through this very vigilant nursing assessment, is that enough and TEXA does not need to do it?
I think Australians would like to be assured that there is some overarching national regulator that is ensuring that qualifications are benchmarked to an appropriate standard. So I think TESCA provides insurance or assurance of that. But I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done between stopping overlap and duplication between the professional accreditation bodies and the national regulator, and we're starting down that track now with the Professionals Association's MOU with Universities Australia, and hopefully that can be sorted out in the near term.
Consistency is essential.
Yep.
And I
think if you have multiple regulators, you're going to have a mess.
You lose that. So we've got a question about choice and transparent information, and a question about how this operates in so-called thin markets where there are relatively few players. Can choice work for, say, someone living in a regional centre where there's only one university? How does a choice-based system work for them?
I think that's a really good question, in the sense that I think it's fair to say that in cities like Sydney and Melbourne, now there is intense competition between institutions and not just the universities for students. It is absolutely true that for regional students, they do not have that same sort of competition unless they make the decision, of course, to come into the capital cities. The point I was making in my address, which was clear to the panel, is the difficulty also, though, is it is those people in regional Australia who often have the least access to the information that is necessary to make decisions. So even for them to actually have those decisions on, well, is it worth going to Sydney or Melbourne or going to ANU, for example, to make that decision? Is it a sensible thing for me to do 2 years of my degree here and then move into the city? Is it sensible for me to start at this institution and, if then successful, then make a judgment that I want to transfer? Even though they're thin markets, that information will still be really important. And it's important also for schools, because, as Phil said, one of our real problems is, both at the school level and at the university level, one of the real weaknesses in our system at the moment is the decline in people able to give career advice. One of the reasons why students take longer than you might think to complete is the sheer number who, after a year, realise actually they're in the wrong program, they really didn't want to do this, and start all over again. Now, I'd have to say it is very sad what's happened to the funding of career advisors in schools. And if you look at universities, I think we are pretty persuaded that Australian universities, compared to UK universities, place much less emphasis on career advice when students first come to the university. In many UK universities now, your first week at the university, you will sit down with a careers advisor who will talk to you about what you want to do. Is this the right course you're doing? We do not have that across all our institutions.
And I'd add to Peter's point that go to any American university and they have an extra week before orientation week, which is for first-in-family students. So for both international students and first-in-family domestic students, there's an extra week they're required to attend that provides them with a lot more course information and a lot more intervention support before they actually even get exposed to the joys of O Week.
Absolutely.
And I think that's where some of the panel's work has been to not only work with the students but work with the influences of students. So in a lot of our work we've considered submissions from parents, from career advisory groups, from principals, from the network of people who support student decisions, but not only school leaver decision makers, how people who are non-school leavers access information about the tertiary education system. I think we felt there was a gap there, because a lot of those interventions and programs are designed at a school leaver, but we know from the work on admissions that there are high percentages of people who've come as non-direct school leavers, and the way in which information is provided to them is actually a gap in the system also.
Okay. I'm getting the wind up, so unfortunately with a few questions left that we have to conclude the session, so thank you, Peter.